There is a valley in the Cotswolds, a few miles south of Stroud, where the road runs out and the trees close in over your head. You leave the car at a gate and you walk. The path drops down through beech and oak into a steep-sided combe, and the temperature falls with it, because the sun does not reach the bottom of this valley for much of the day. A chain of 5 lakes lies strung along the floor of the valley like beads on a wire, dark and still and green. Herons stand in the shallows, the water does not move, and there is no sound except your own footsteps, and somewhere out of sight, the trickle of a stream feeding the next lake down. You walk for the better part of a mile, and then the trees pull back and you see it. A great house rises out of the hillside, grey Cotswold limestone, sharp gables, tall pointed windows, gargoyles snarling from the eaves, a clock tower, a chapel wing. It looks like a medieval abbey, or a French chateau that has wandered across the channel and lost its way. It is enormous, and it is beautiful, and it is utterly silent. There is no smoke from the chimneys. There are no curtains at the windows. There is no gravel drive sweeping up to a grand front door, because in a sense there is no grand front door at all. And then you get closer, and you begin to notice the wrongness. There are doorways on the upper floors that open onto nothing but a drop into empty air. There are magnificent stone fireplaces set high in the walls with no floor beneath them and no floor in front of them. There are staircases that climb towards ceilings that were never built. In one room the plaster has been spread halfway across a wall and then simply stopped. The trowel marks still visible in the surface after more than 150 years, as though the workmen had been called away for a moment and had never come back. Because that is exactly what happened. This is Woodchester Mansion. It was begun in the 1850s and it has never been finished, and no family has ever lived in it, not for a single night. It is one of the strangest buildings in Britain, a house frozen forever at the moment of its own creation. And this is the dark story of how it came to be, and of the man whose faith and fortune raised it out of this valley, and of the day the builders put down their tools and walked away and never returned. The story begins not in Gloucestershire but in Liverpool, in the roar of the docks at the beginning of the 19th century. William Leigh was born in 1802 into one of the great merchant fortunes of that boom town. His father traded in salt and tobacco and foodstuffs through the port of Liverpool at the height of its power, when the city was the second harbour of the British Empire and its warehouses were stacked with the wealth of the world. When Leigh Sr. died, his son inherited on a scale that is difficult to convey. At the age of 13, William Leigh came into £100,000 and the Robbie Hall estate at Huyton, just outside Liverpool. In the money of his own day that was a colossal sum. In ours it would run comfortably into the tens of millions. He was not, however, raised to be a merchant. He was sent to Eton and then to Brasenose College at Oxford, and he was fashioned into an English gentleman. In 1828 he married Caroline Cotterell and settled at Little Aston Hall in Staffordshire, and for a time he lived the ordinary life of a wealthy landowner of his class. He hunted, he managed his estates, he raised his children. He was, by every account, a serious and thoughtful and rather austere man, more comfortable with a book than with company. But something was working on William Leigh in those years, and to understand what happened to him, and therefore what happened in this valley, you have to understand what was happening to the whole of religious England at the time. Leigh had been raised in the Church of England, as almost every gentleman of his standing was, but in the 1830s and 1840s a great convulsion was passing through that church. At Oxford, a group of clergymen and scholars had begun to argue that the Church of England had drifted too far from its ancient Catholic roots, that it had stripped away the ceremony and the mystery and the authority of the older faith and left something cold and thin in its place. They were called the Oxford Movement, and their most famous figure, John Henry Newman, would follow the logic of his own argument all the way across the divide. In 1845 Newman was received into the Roman Catholic Church, and he shook the establishment to its foundations. William Leigh was caught in that same current, and a year before Newman, in 1844, at Leamington Spa, William Leigh took the step that would define the rest of his life and empty his fortune into the ground of a Cotswold valley. He was received into the Roman Catholic Church. It is difficult now to grasp what that meant for a man of his position. To become a Catholic in Victorian England was not a private matter of conscience. It was a social earthquake. The Catholic faith had been the enemy of the English state for 3 centuries. Catholics had only been permitted to sit in Parliament since 1829. They were regarded by much of respectable society with suspicion bordering on contempt, as foreign, as disloyal, as somehow un-English. For a wealthy gentleman with a fortune from the Liverpool docks to abandon the church of his ancestors and go over to Rome was to cut himself off from a great deal of the world he had been raised in. And William Leigh did not do it by halves. He was, in the phrase used of him ever after, a zealous convert. The zeal of a man who has found his purpose late and means to spend the rest of his life proving it. He did not simply want to be a Catholic. He wanted to build a Catholic world. He wanted to plant the old faith back into the English soil, brick by brick and stone by stone, and to leave behind him a monument that would stand for centuries as proof of what one man's belief could raise. He began to look for the ground on which to build it. In 1845, the year after his conversion, William Leigh found his valley. The Ducey family, who had held an estate in this steep wooded common near the village of Nymphsfield for generations, were selling. There was a Georgian house at the bottom of the valley called Spring Park, a chain of ornamental lakes laid out in the previous century by the hands of famous landscape gardeners, and around 4,000 acres of parkland, farm and hanging beechwood. Leigh paid £170,000 for the whole of it. He was buying not just a house, but the setting for an entire Catholic community, a place remote enough and complete enough to be a world of its own. His first act tells you everything about the order of his priorities. He did not begin with a house for himself. He began with a church. At the eastern edge of his new estate at South Woodchester, Leigh set about building a Catholic church and a monastery, so that the old faith would have a home in this corner of Protestant England and a body of monks to keep its offices going. And to design them, he reached for the most famous Catholic architect in the country. He reached for Augustus Welby Northmore Pugin. Pugin is one of the towering figures of Victorian architecture. He was the man who, more than any other, made the Gothic style the language of Victorian Britain. He designed much of the interior of the new Palace of Westminster. He believed, with a burning and almost religious intensity, that Gothic architecture was not merely a style but a moral truth. That the pointed arch and the honest stone of the medieval cathedral expressed a purer and holier way of building and of living than the cold classical fashions that had come after. He was, like Leigh, a passionate Catholic convert. On paper, the two men were made for one another. In January 1846, Pugin came to the valley and surveyed the old Georgian mansion of Spring Park, and he did not like what he saw. His verdict was blunt. He wrote that it was a more hopeless case of repairs than he had ever seen, and he advised Leigh to pull it down and start again. Pugin drew up designs for the Church of the Annunciation, and for the adjoining monastery. But the partnership did not last. By August of that same year, only months in, Pugin resigned from the work. The two men, both proud, both certain of their own vision, seemed simply not to have suited each other. And so, the religious buildings were completed by another Catholic architect, Charles Hansom of Bristol, brother of the man who gave his name to the hansom cab. The Church of the Annunciation rose in 1849, and the monastery in 1853, and Leigh had the beginnings of his Catholic community in the valley. But the great house, the mansion that was to be his own seat, and the centrepiece of the whole vision was still to come, and the man who would design it was not yet an architect at all. His name was Benjamin Bucknall. He was born in 1833, which means that when the work on the mansion began in earnest, he was barely into his 20s. He was a local man, a convert to Catholicism like his patron, and he had come up through the office of Charles Hansom, learning his trade on Leigh's own religious buildings. He had no great reputation. He had built nothing of note. And yet William Leigh handed this young man the commission of a lifetime, an unlimited canvas and a very deep purse, and told him to build the finest house he could imagine. To understand what Bucknall did with that gift, you have to understand the strange and beautiful idea that had taken hold of him. Bucknall had discovered, in William Leigh's own library, the writings of a Frenchman named Eugène-Emmanuel Viollet-le-Duc. Viollet-le-Duc was the greatest architectural theorist of his age, the man who restored the medieval cathedrals of France, who rebuilt the walls of the fortress town of Carcassonne, who put the spire back on Notre Dame in Paris, and he preached a doctrine that seized the young Bucknall completely. It was the doctrine of truth in building. Viollet-le-Duc taught that a building should never lie, that every stone should do a real job, that structure should never be hidden behind decoration, that ornament should grow out of the way a thing was actually made, that a wall should look like a wall, and a support should look like a support, and nothing should pretend to be anything other than what it was. Honesty carried into stone. Bucknall did not merely admire this idea, he gave his life to it. He taught himself French so that he could read Viollet-le-Duc in the original. He wrote to the great man, and 7 of those letters survive. He crossed to France and visited the buildings and met Viollet-le-Duc in person, and in the years that followed he would translate the Frenchman's major works into English, one after another, so that they could be read across the Channel. Bucknall became, in effect, the voice of Viollet-le-Duc in the English language, and his translations would travel far beyond this valley. They would be read decades later, on the other side of the Atlantic, by a young American architect named Frank Lloyd Wright. But all of that was still ahead of him. For now, in the late 1850s, Benjamin Bucknall had a hillside, a fortune, and a doctrine, and he began to build the purest expression of truth in building that England would ever see. Look at what he made, and you begin to understand the obsession. Everything at Woodchester is stone. Not stone facing over a brick core, which was the ordinary Victorian way, but stone all the way through, structural and honest to the bone. The ceilings are not plastered flat and hidden, they are vaulted in carved stone ribbed like the roof of a cathedral, an extraordinary and almost unheard of thing to do in a private house. Even the drain pipes are made of stone. Bucknall would not permit an iron gutter or a lead downpipe to spoil the honesty of the thing, and so the rainwater runs down carved stone channels held out from the walls on carved stone brackets, a detail so peculiar and so pure that it has become his signature. The gargoyles that spring from the eaves are not idle decoration. They are the ends of the water spouts, doing the job gargoyles were first invented to do, throwing the rain clear of the walls, and Bucknall carved them as the creatures of the hunt, 2 hounds baring their teeth, a fox, a wild boar, a memory of the deer park this valley had once been. Inside, the ambition only grows. There is a great hall meant to be the beating heart of the house. There is a chapel of astonishing quality, its ceiling ribbed in delicate tierceron vaulting, its stone bosses carved so deeply and so finely that you can pick out the wildflowers of this very valley in the leaves, and among them 2 green men, those ancient pagan faces peering out of the foliage, smuggled into the most sacred room in the house. There is a confessional cut into the stone. There are galleries in the French manner, and then there is the bathroom. High in the house, cantilevered out from the wall so that it seems to hang in the air, is a room built around a single enormous block of stone hollowed out to make a bath, with taps carved from stone fed by a system Bucknall engineered himself. Nearby there was to be a room for the water cure, the fashionable Victorian therapy of cold showers and cold plunges, and here the shower head was carved in the shape of a leopard, so that the water would fall from the mouth of a stone beast. Everywhere you look, the mind of a young man wholly and joyfully lost in his idea, spending another man's fortune to build something that had never existed and would never exist again. But every stone of it cost money, and no fortune, however large, is bottomless. Here we should pause, because if you are enjoying this descent into one of the strangest houses in Britain, take a moment to subscribe to the channel. We tell the dark stories of Britain's great estates, the beautiful houses and the ruin and obsession behind them, and there is a great deal more to come. Subscribe and walk these corridors with us. Now, the money. William Leigh was extraordinarily rich, but he was pouring his fortune into the ground on 3 fronts at once. He had bought the estate outright. He had built and endowed a church and a monastery. And now he was raising the most expensive kind of house it is possible to build. A house made entirely of hand-carved stone, vaulted like a cathedral, with a workforce of skilled masons who had to cut and dress and set every single block by hand. There were no shortcuts at Woodchester. That was the whole point. Truth in building does not come cheap. And so, the work went in fits and starts, at the pace the money and the men allowed. The earliest surviving drawings are dated 1857. The clock tower carries the date 1858. Inscriptions scratched into the plaster show that the roof was finished by 1866. For something like 15 years, the masons worked their way up through the house, floor by floor, vault by vault, and Leigh himself supervised, a perfectionist watching every detail, which slowed things further still. This was not a man in a hurry. This was a man building for eternity, and he seems to have half believed he had eternity to do it in. He did not. Beyond the money and the slowness, there was another problem, quieter and harder to fix. The workforce came and went. Skilled masons were not always to be had in a remote valley in Gloucestershire, and the work paused whenever the men or the funds ran short. And through the 1860s, William Leigh was growing old, and his health was failing. The perfectionist at the heart of the whole enterprise, the man whose faith and money and will were the only things holding it together, was slowing down. The community he had dreamed of never quite took root either. The religious life he had planted at South Woodchester did not flourish as he had hoped. The valley was remote, the monastery struggled, and the grand Catholic world Leigh had set out to build was proving harder to raise than the stones of his house. He had imagined a living community, monks and worshippers and a great family seat, all bound together in the old faith. What he was actually building, though he cannot have known it, was a monument to an idea that would outlive everyone who believed in it. By around 1868 or 1870, the pace had slowed almost to nothing, and in January 1873, with the mansion still unfinished, its rooms still open to the sky in places, its plaster half spread, its fireplaces hanging in mid-air, William Leigh died. He was buried not with pomp in some great cathedral, but in the quiet Catholic ground of the valley he had bought and loved. And the great house he had raised as the centrepiece of his life's work stood over the lakes, roofed, walled, magnificent and empty. Everything now depended on his heir. His son, Willie Leigh, inherited the estate in 1873, and Willie was faced with a cold and simple sum. His father had left him a house that was, on paper, close to finished. The estimates that came in that year, one from James Wilson of Bath, and one from Bucknall himself the following year, suggested that it would cost only around £7,000 more to complete the mansion. In the scale of what had already been spent, that was almost nothing. The finish line was in sight. But there was a second number, and it was the one that killed the house. To run Woodchester Mansion once it was finished, to staff it and heat it and maintain that vast expanse of carved stone and stone vaulting and stone drainpipe, would cost something like £7,000 to £8,000 every single year. And that annual figure was roughly double the entire income of the estate. It was, in other words, a house that could be finished but could never be afforded. A house designed to be lived in only by a man with a Liverpool merchant's fortune behind him, and that fortune had gone into the walls. Willie Leigh did the only sensible thing. He stopped. He did not finish his father's mansion. He did not move into it. Instead, he took the old gardener's cottage on the estate, a building known simply as the cottage, and he extended it again and again until it had 15 bedrooms and served as the family home. The Leighs lived out their lives at Woodchester in a made-over cottage, while the palace their patriarch had built stood a short walk away, roofed and silent, its great hall never lit, its chapel never given over to daily worship, its stone bath never filled. And the family that had built it began, slowly, to fade. Willie borrowed too heavily in the 1880s, and the estate slid into financial trouble. The place was rescued in the early 1900s, largely by his eldest daughter, Blanche, a determined and devout woman who took the business in hand, hired a capable agent named Ernest Poulton in 1905, and dragged the estate back towards solvency. Willie died in 1906. His eldest son Frank inherited and died only months later, in early 1907, a sick man. A second son, Vincent, carried on. But the family was running out of both money and heirs, and in 1922 Vincent sold the whole estate to a buyer named J.H. Tooley for £52,000, acting on behalf of his sister Blanche. Here is the quiet tragedy at the root of it all. Not one of William Leigh's grandchildren ever had children of their own. Blanche and her sister Beatrice ended their days in a lodge at the western end of the park. Blanche died in 1946, Beatrice died in 1949, and with them the line of the man who had poured a fortune into this valley simply stopped. The family died out. The house they could not afford to finish outlived every one of them, and what of the young architect, the true believer, the boy who had taught himself French to read Viollet-le-Duc and had built this cathedral of a house to the doctrine of truth? Benjamin Bucknall's later life is one of the strangest turns in the whole story. When the work at Woodchester ground to a halt, Bucknall was still a relatively young man with the finest unfinished building in England to his name and almost nothing else. He had given his best years to a house that would never be completed. And at some point, this Gloucestershire convert, this disciple of French Gothic rationalism, made a decision that nobody could have predicted. He left England altogether, he went to North Africa, he settled in Algiers, and there, under the North African sun, the man who had carved snarling English gargoyles and green men into Cotswold limestone reinvented himself completely. In Algeria, Benjamin Bucknall designed and restored elegant white villas in the Moorish style, the very opposite of the heavy grey Gothic of the valley he had left behind. He restored the Villa Montfeld at El Biar above Algiers. He became a well-known and respected figure in the city. There is a road in Algiers named after him to this day, the Chemin Bucknall, and through those same years he kept translating Viollet-le-Duc, faithful to the end to the Frenchman whose ideas had shaped his whole life, sending the great man's words out into English so that architects yet unborn could read them. He died in Algeria in 1895, thousands of miles from the unfinished masterpiece in the Cotswold Valley. He had built the purest Gothic house in England and then walked away to build white villas in the sun. The mansion he left behind never got its architect back. And so the decades passed, and the great empty house began the long, slow business of being forgotten. After the family sold up, the estate was broken apart, the outlying farms were sold off. Blanche Leigh clung to the 1,000-acre core, including the park and the mansion itself, and looked for a buyer. She hoped, fittingly, to sell to a religious order, but in the end she agreed, with visible reluctance, to sell to Barnwood House Hospital, an institution for mental and nervous disorders. She was troubled to the last by the thought, as she put it, that the beautiful chapel would now be used for non-Catholic worship. The hospital's plans for the place never came to anything, and in 1953 they sold it on. During the Second World War, the valley had one strange, brief moment of life. Troops were stationed in Woodchester Park, and they used the chain of lakes to practice building pontoon bridges, rehearsing for the river crossings of the coming invasion of Europe. For a few years the silent valley echoed with engines and shouted orders, and the splash of men and timber in the water. And then the soldiers left for the beaches of Normandy, and the silence came back down over the lakes, and it has never really lifted since. But those soldiers, as we shall see, are said not to have left entirely. Through the 1950s, a man named Reginald Kelly held the cottage and the mansion, and to his credit he kept the roof sound and did the essential work that stopped a roofed building from becoming a ruin. But from the mid-1970s even that care fell away. Neglect crept in. Damp worked at the stone. The valley reclaimed its edges, ivy and bramble and beech seedling pressing in at the walls. The most extraordinary unfinished house in Britain sat at the bottom of its hidden combe, a mile from the nearest road, slowly going under. It was saved, in the end, almost by its own geography. Its very remoteness protected it. There was no road to bring the vandals and no developer who could see a profit in a valley you had to walk into. By 1988, local people had had enough of watching it decay, and Stroud District Council stepped in and bought the mansion together with 23 acres around it. The following year, the Woodchester Mansion Trust was founded to care for it, and the trust made a decision that has defined the place ever since. A decision as strange and as honest in its way as the house itself. They decided not to finish it. They decided not to restore it to some imagined completeness it had never actually possessed. They would conserve it exactly as it was. They would keep it standing and keep the weather out and keep it safe, but they would leave the trowel marks in the plaster and the doorways opening onto air and the fireplaces hanging in the walls. They would preserve the moment of abandonment forever. Which brings us to the strangest thing about Woodchester. To walk into it is to walk into a building caught in the act of being made. Come inside now and see what that means. You step through into rooms that are, in the ordinary sense, finished. The walls are up, the vaults are carved, the window tracery is cut, and then, again and again, you come upon the moment the work stopped, and it is like coming upon a clock that halted at a single second and never moved again. There is a fireplace, a beautiful thing, carved and set into the wall exactly where it should be, but it is set at the height of the floor that was going to be there, and the floor was never laid. So the fireplace hangs in the wall above your head, an ornate stone hearth suspended over nothing, waiting for a room that never arrived. There are doorways on the upper stories, properly framed in dressed stone that open straight out into empty air because the corridor or the room they were meant to serve was never built. A door to nowhere. Open it, and you would step out into a fall. In the great hall, the corbels jut from the walls, The carved stone brackets that were meant to carry the timbers of a grand roof and a great floor, and they carry nothing. They reach out into the space and hold up the air. On one wall, the plaster tells the whole story in a single frozen gesture. The plasterer had begun to skim it, working across the stone, and then he stopped, mid-stroke, and you can still see the exact line where the wet plaster ended and the bare stone began, the edge of it feathered where his trowel lifted away. He put down his tools, and in more than a century and a half no one has ever picked them up. Think about what that plaster really is. It is a Tuesday afternoon in the late 1860s, held in place forever. It is the moment the money ran short, or the men were sent home, or word came down the valley that old Mr. Leigh was failing, made solid and permanent in lime and sand. Every unfinished house in Britain was once a building site. What makes Woodchester unique is that the building site never became anything else. It was not knocked down. It was not completed. It was not even really abandoned to ruin, because the roof stayed on and the walls stayed sound. It was simply stopped, and then kept, and then, eventually, treasured, precisely for the fact of its stopping. Stand in the middle of that great cold hall under the vaulting, with the light coming grey and even through the huge south-facing windows, and the sensation is difficult to describe. It is not the feeling of a ruin. A ruin is a thing that was alive and then died. This is something else. This is a thing that was never quite born. The house has no memories of dinners or dances or children on the stairs, because there were none. No one was ever happy here. No one ever grieved here. No family ever lived a single day within these walls. It is a house without a past, and yet it feels more haunted than houses stacked 3 centuries deep in their own history. Because what haunts Woodchester is not the dead. It is the might have been. It is the ghost of the life that was designed, drawn, costed, carved in stone, and then never lived. And yet Woodchester is not empty. Far from it. In the years since the Trust took it on, the house is filled with life of a kind that William Leigh could never have foreseen, and it has gathered around itself a reputation for the uncanny that has made it one of the most famous haunted buildings in Britain. Start with the living. High in the attics of the unfinished house, in the roof spaces above those rooms that were never floored, there is a colony of bats. Not ordinary bats. Woodchester is home to a maternity roost of greater and lesser horseshoe bats, 2 of the rarest and most threatened bat species in Europe. Every April the females return to this valley, and by the end of June and into July they give birth to their young, the tiny pups clinging in the dark, and by August the colony swells toward 1,000 animals. And here is the quiet irony at the centre of it. The very thing that ruined the house as a home is what makes it perfect for the bats. The unfinished roof spaces, the rough undivided attics, the fact that no family ever moved in to seal and heat and disturb them, all of it has made Woodchester one of the most important bat roosts in the country. The colony has become the subject of one of the most remarkable pieces of science in the natural world. Since 1959, the bats of Woodchester have been studied by Dr. Roger Ransom, decade after decade, generation after generation of bats, in what is regarded as one of the longest continuous studies of any wild mammal population ever undertaken by a single person. Today, infrared cameras watch the roosts, and the images are fed to screens in an observatory in the house, so that visitors can sit in the great unfinished mansion and watch the rarest bats in Britain raising their young in the dark above their heads, and at dusk see them pour out of the eaves to hunt over the black water of the lakes. The house that never gave shelter to a single human family has given shelter to 1,000 bats a year, and to the longest bat study on earth. And then there are the ghosts. Woodchester's reputation for the supernatural is enormous, out of all proportion even to its strangeness, and the ghost hunters have made a place of pilgrimage out of it. The stories go back a long way. The oldest of them belongs to the house that stood here before, when in 1840 the 2nd Earl of Ducie is said to have thrown a grand party and looked up to see the ghost of his own dead father seated silently at the head of the table. But it is the mansion itself that has drawn the modern legends. Visitors and investigators speak of a young girl seen skipping up and down the grand staircase, quite unbothered by the startled people who catch sight of her, and of a girl's voice heard singing an old Irish air in the empty rooms. They speak of a woman standing motionless at a first-floor window, staring out over the valley watching the visitors come and go. They speak of the chapel, where people have reported the sound of chanting, the figure of a monk at silent prayer, and the smell of candles that have only just been blown out, drifting through a chapel that was never regularly used. There is a story of a small man near the chapel, who seems anxious about damage to the stonework, as though some craftsman's spirit is still fretting over a job left undone. And there is a darker pair of figures in the old kitchen, a terrified young man crouching as if to hide, and a tall, menacing shape looming in the doorway over him, a little scene of fear that plays out again and again in an empty room. And there are the soldiers. The men who came in the Second World War to practice their bridges on the lakes are woven into the legend too. The story told in the valley is that when one of those training exercises went wrong and lives were lost in the water, the bodies were brought up to the mansion, and that the soldiers have never entirely left, that figures in wartime uniforms still walk the corridors of the house that briefly held their dead. Visitors and investigators have added their own encounters over the years, a horseman glimpsed in the grounds, a tall dark figure on the stairs, and in a valley that was inhabited as far back as Roman times, and where a Roman villa with an Orpheus mosaic once stood close by, even the shade of a Roman soldier has been claimed among the shadows. How much of this is real, and how much is the ordinary machinery of a cold, remote, echoing building at the bottom of a dark valley, each of us can decide. The Trust runs the mansion as a place for paranormal events, and it has drawn the ghost hunting television programs over the years, cameras and thermal sensors and overnight vigils in the Great Hall, the crews of shows like Most Haunted spending the small hours in the unfinished rooms. What is certain is that Woodchester does something to people. Stand in it after dark in the unfinished vaults, with the wind moving in the roof space where the bats hang and the stone drain pipes running with rain, and the plaster still bearing the marks of a hand that stopped a century and a half ago, and it is very hard indeed to feel that you are alone. Today the house belongs to the Trust, and the valley around it belongs to the nation. In 1994, the National Trust bought Woodchester Park, the whole long wooded comm with its 5 lakes and its lost 18th and 19th century landscape, its boathouse and its heronry, its red kites and deer, and its rare bats, a place so rich in wildlife that it is protected as a site of special scientific interest. And so the visitor walks down through the beechwoods, past the still dark water, and comes upon the great grey house exactly as you did at the beginning of this story, and finds it exactly as the masons left it, roofed and walled and beautiful and stopped. William Leigh set out to build a monument to his faith that would stand for 1,000 years and shelter a living Catholic world. He got something stranger and in the end more lasting. He built a house that no one could finish and no one could afford and no one ever lived in, and by never being completed it became unforgettable. His fortune is in these walls, his family is gone, his architect lies in Algeria, and his mansion stands at the bottom of its valley, holding its single unfinished moment forever, waiting for a life that is never going to come. The plaster is still wet on the wall, the door still opens onto nothing, and somewhere above, in the dark of the roof, 1,000 bats are waking. If you walk these corridors with us, subscribe to the channel, and tell us in the comments which of Britain's great houses we should descend into next. The mansion nobody ever lived in is not empty. It never was.